Hello and welcome to another episode of SyrupCast. My name is Daniel Bader, and as always, I'm joined by Douglas Soltys, who this week is a little bit indisposed. He's here, but he may not be completely here. Tell me about your troubles, Douglas.
I'm getting old and closer to death, and my body's falling apart.
That is the theme of the podcast this week. We're talking about death.
Yeah.
Now, I think we're contractually obligated to begin the podcast talking about basketball, right? So, just to give a quick refresher, the Cavs played the Golden State Warriors, the Cleveland Cavaliers, the Golden State Warriors in the first game of the NBA Finals last night at Oracle Center in San Francisco, and it was a good game. And it went into overtime. Tell us what happened in overtime, Douglas.
Simply, LeBron failed to score any Hufflepuffs, leading to a scenario where the snitch was just ungraspable. No, yeah, it's, I'm sure my back feels slightly better than LeBron James's whole body after shouldering the weight of a city and a team. But yeah, man, it was a great game. Just, I think the positive side of things, they went in there on a road game for game one and almost stole it. They steal the next one. They have home court advantage,
Right.
And they were able to hang with Golden State literally the entire game until overtime when Kyrie went out. Of course, Kyrie Irving being hurt, limping around like I am, doesn't look good.
No, it's going to be a question of whether the rest of the Cavs can step up if Kyrie is out for the rest of the series. He won't want to be out. I think he'll try to come back, but I'm sure the coach will have something to say about that. So that was our basketball segment. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. This has been the SyrupCast. Let's talk a little bit about Google I/O. So we haven't had a cast for a couple of weeks, and Google I/O came and went. I went and came. No. I went down there and I sat through the actually quite abbreviated keynote that had a bunch of sort of less than exciting announcements. Android M, Google Photos, Now on Tap was a big part of its the Google Now's expansion. A few other things that we'll get into, but mostly it was about Android M and Google Photos as consumer-focused products, and the rest of them were obviously more developer-focused, given the developer theme of the event. But I guess let's start with Android M, because Android is always moving along at a pretty fast clip. Did you get a sense of how Google sort of came into this, Douglas? Do you see this strategy that they're embarking on, kind of slowing things down and taking a bit more of an iterative approach to the Android strategy?
Well, I think we talked about it on the podcast last week. It's like similar to what Apple's doing. Like you've now created all these touch points and you've been building. Now it's time to make sure that the code works and works well, right? So, M from a certain standpoint is like even more of a cleanup than Lollipop was, or not enhancement, but I guess efficiency is the word that I'm looking for, right?
Yeah. I think you're onto something there. I know that one of the key things that David Burke said, who's the VP of engineering for Android, was that M is more about refinement and experience than it is about new features. So one of the major issues that was addressed was app permissions, the fact that they are now addressing an issue that many Android users have complained about, the fact that you couldn't individually turn off permissions per app.
Yeah.
That's being addressed.
And then also the fact that the permission is asked for when needed, not all up front, which is
right.
That's an example of like, this is one of those things where, okay, that's like a really minor thing, but those are the types of little things that drive people towards one platform or another when it comes to an experience. So for them to take if Lollipop was the visual overhaul. In certain ways, this is kind of like that functional overhaul. Similarly, if you want to draw like the iOS 7 to iOS 8 comparisons,
Right.
they made it really, really pretty, and now they're going to make it even more functionally kind of simple and useful and things like that. But can we talk just a bit about your experience, like just in being there, right? Like it wasn't one of those like 12-hour keynotes. But it was also a keynote where they're going to be like, hey, we're announcing iterative updates and a giant Photos app. So like, what's the vibe in the room there?
So I got there on Tuesday. I had a couple of days before the keynote to do a little shopping, a little vacationing, whatever.
San
and I
Fran,
thought, yeah, it was awesome. It was a fantastic trip. Wednesday was really interesting because Google did the keynote access for developers a little differently. They did it first come, first serve. And they asked developers to line up on Wednesday morning to receive their wristbands for the keynote because there were only 3,000 seats in the auditorium and there were far more attendees at the conference itself, over 5,000. So when I got to the line at around 9 a.m. on Wednesday, there was a line stretched around the block and onto Minna Street, which is just an enormous line. There were probably 1,500 people in line, and it showed the sheer enthusiasm for what Google is doing, even though most developers knew that the announcements themselves wouldn't be as groundbreaking as they were last year. I think everybody wants Google to have some. I mean, it's inevitable that even an iOS or sometimes even a Windows Phone developer will have to access Google APIs. They have to deal with the Google ecosystem. And an increasing number of Android apps are, relying on these underlying Google Play services to make their apps better. So even if it was just to get access to the keynote or to sit in some of the sessions, I spoke to a lot of developers who wanted to be around their peers. They wanted to have access to Google developer evangelists to go over the specifics of what's new with Android M. And I think from sort of an overall how did the event go perspective, Google ran this like the tightest ship I'd ever seen. It was just phenomenal. Everything ran on time. Everything was super organized. They made the Moscone Center into a really warm place to be. They opened up areas that were previously enclosed. They had beanbag chairs all over the place. They had free coffee and drinks whenever and wherever you wanted it. Great food. They made this a really fun event to be at. And I think Google has learned its lesson from the previous three keynotes, at least from my perspective. Keep it short, keep it to the point, and add value through the developer sessions. So I went to a bunch of developer sessions and found that they didn't really talk about a whole lot of things in the keynote because they wanted to keep them exciting in the developer sessions.
Well, yeah. Also, if it's that granular type stuff where it's like we're literally just going to discuss the implementation of this thing that is smoother, or easier, or better, you do not need to keynote that. I know there's that long-standing tradition of you always love to see someone open up a terminal, type in some code to show it working live. But at the end of the day, you can do that in the breakout sessions with the experts. So yeah, I definitely hear what you're saying. It sounds like great event for developers, which is what these things normally are or should be, and ran well because they were able to focus on the experience of the event as a developer event rather than making sure that they stick the landing on major announcements, at least from like a mobile Android perspective, right? Because not being there, I feel like two things came about. It's like, okay, everyone's from a consumer perspective is really excited about photos because that's been this thing that would previously tied to Google Plus that people are excited about using and then also concerned about using. And then, all the crazy stuff is happening within Google, just not tied to Android, and all the ATAP stuff where it's just like, oh, here's another, bajillion-dollar industry that we're going to tackle, or here's this futuristic thing we're going to do. And maybe the pure mobile component of that just isn't, it's just like, yeah, we're cleaning it up, we're making it better. The consumer experience is going to be good. And then here's all the futuristic stuff that we're doing.
Yeah. I mean, Google Photos was one of the everybody had been expecting, but the finished product was so good that most people didn't really care that it was not exciting, in the sense that it didn't have anything fundamentally new that they didn't already know about.
Yeah.
Google Photos is super interesting because it has this very kind of obvious role as a curator of all of your photos, right? From your phone, from your desktop, from anywhere that you've previously taken photos, because it has an uploader from your Mac or Windows. It's constantly backing up your various Android and iOS devices. But then it uses deep machine learning to figure out things about your photos that you didn't even know. And I think that that's what's so impressive about this and so interesting, is that Google is taking a very simple idea and giving you additional context. And they're taking what I believe to be the virtues of something like Google Now and adding it to your photo albums or your photo, history. For example, when I open up Photos for the first time, the new assistant feature took me all the way back to 2011 when I first started uploading my photos to Google, and gave me all of these amazing collages, amazing GIFs, amazing, filtered photos that gave it a little bit of a new look. And normally I would never go to the trouble of doing that myself because, I mean, to be honest, I don't really look back at a lot of my photos and want to change them. I just want to kind of, appreciate what I was doing at the time. But given these new contexts and these new looks, it really has an emotional impact on your photos. And that's kind of the point, being able to filter based on location, based on even on face, even though, and we'll talk about it in a second, but, being able to filter it properly is an amazing achievement.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about that? So like, in reading about like the coverage, and then just seeing other stuff on the net, like Google's mandate is two things, firstly, that Facebook connect the world, and then to organize the world's data, right?
Right.
From the beginning as a search engine, to even Gmail, it's always been about finding really useful ways to organize data. And, photo data is probably the last of the major like data sets that every consumer uses that has been, kind of a hassle to deal with, right? We take all these photos, they either sit on our device or we upload them somewhere. They're just inert. And considering, the extent to which people love visual information, capturing moments, having a really compelling product along this line, it could be a huge win for them, like huge. That said, man, does it wig me out when knowing that Google can not only know who I am and everything about me, but literally know who all my friends are by identifying them in photos that I've taken. Like that is, and that's where it gets to, this long running conversation I've been having on Twitter with, our fellow compatriots in the tech space, like shout out Sasha Sagan. What's up? It's like, man, really want to try this product. Don't know if I want to, jump off the iceberg and fully commit, especially when it comes to levels of like, oh yeah, I don't care. I have nothing to hide. You can have my data. But it's like, yeah, now you're giving Google the ability to like index the time, location, and facial information of all the people just because you took a photo of them or you're in a photo with them. That's
even when there's no metadata in the photo itself.
Yeah, they're just doing the work. Yeah, totally.
Creepy and impressive part about that processing.
They're not just indexing the data, they're creating a data index through the machine learning and their ability to just, pull stuff together, which is like
But I mean, okay, so isn't that Google's purpose though, is to create organization out of chaos? I mean, when you search for a term on Google, you generally search for something that's extremely broad, and it attempts to give you the most, I guess, useful results on that
Yeah.
first page based on a lot of things it knows about you. For example, your social networks that you're logged into at the time, your search history, your location. I mean, these are things that people find extremely useful.
Oh,
But
totally. And
given,
we're dealing with this. We see this every day, right? I would say two things. First of all, just because we see this every day in other formats, shout out Ronnie. Oh, that's Chester. Um, doesn't mean that it's necessarily like isn't problematic, especially without a a data bill of rights
sure,
that we have around access to information, privacy, things like that. And then second, you know, Google reads every word that we write and receive in our Gmail accounts, right? They basically have our locations, they have our search history, like, they have all of that. When it comes to the visual component, like, oh, I can recognize you. I think it's just, even if it's really no functionally different, there's an emotional human weight to the fact that they know who I am. And they know, like, for me, it's really just like, they can identify people around me, people that I know don't want, who are very specific in their privacy and wouldn't want a company knowing something about them just because they're in a photo with me, like, that was never even shared publicly. That's just
sure.
sorted and indexed. So it just, that emotional thing makes you pause and reconsider the whole construction of, well, hey, if you want a free app, this is how they work,
I mean, I just like, okay, there's a lot to that, and it's sort of interesting to unpack. So, first of all, from what I understand, the photos, the face identification feature is not yet available in Canada. So, the Google reached out to us afterwards and told us that they are rolling this out just to the US because, as they said, it's a new feature and it's not complete, and they're, as they do with many features, rolling it out in a single market to try, to make it better.
Yeah, one
That
data
said,
set. Yeah,
because I activated it in the US, I now have this people database, this facial database, when I search on Google Photos, and it's interesting because it's super creepy.
yeah.
It's super, super creepy. It crops photos, crops faces, really close, even when the photos themselves were taken very far away. The accuracy is incredible. It's like creepily incredible, and it also will be able to detect a face when that face is partially hidden. So, for example, I have a friend who works for Engadget. His name's Chris Velasco. Shout out, Chris. He is hidden in a bunch of photos in this database because he hates having his photo taken. He always tries to hide whenever I take a photo of him.
Yeah.
But Google, even from just a portion of his face, was able to detect him in every photo. It's freaking crazy.
And that's the thing about like the whole conversation about metadata, right? Is like consent goes out the window when you can infer the information from all the other pieces of information that you have.
Totally.
And I'm not even trying to take this to like a scary level. It's just like the practical ramifications of this being out there. I don't think people realize. And Facebook's already does this, right? Like, we uploaded photos, 40 photos from the beta kit event that we threw last week. And Facebook did a really great job of saying, that's a face, that's a face, that's a face. It's probably this face. But, obviously not to the extent that Google's doing it. But it's, it's just a scenario where, like, I'm not saying that Google is going to do anything wrong with it, but once the capacity is there, unless there is an understanding of what can and cannot be done with information, or what should or should not be done, do I really want to just sign up to see how the future goes? Like, what are you
Okay,
consenting
so
to?
yeah, I I don't know what to tell you. I mean, for example, the facial recognition thing doesn't give you the option of actually categorizing or naming any of these people. So it's doing this in a way that is less of a database and more of an unfiltered list, or it's a sorted filtered list.
Yeah, is that at
But
the
it's
presentation layer, or they're like, I'm sure that they're storing, or like, or have they talked about, you know,
but presumably, so okay, so what's interesting about this is that when I look at this list of people, it's all people that I know. Most of these people would be recognizable to Google on their end,
Mhm.
but there's no names attached to any of these people from a consumer perspective. So when I click on Chris's face, it does come up with 40 odd photos that I've taken of him over the years, but there's nowhere in that does it say Chris Velasco, and nowhere does it associate that with a Google account where it. I don't think it would be trivial, but I think it would be within Google's power to associate a name and a profession and potentially a Google profile with every one of these people.
Hells yeah.
And like, to me, that's the most disruptive and potentially scary part. Like when I click on your face, I have photos going all the way back
Click on my
to
face, Bader.
to like early 2014 when you started with Mobilesyrup. Uh, you're hidden, as I said about Chris, in many of these photos, but it identified you. But at the same time, it relies on me to know who you are, right? Google doesn't prompt me to say who is this person like it does on like Facebook does. Facebook is not asking me to tag you. Google is not asking me to tag you in any of these photos like Facebook does. So it's I mean, it's a privacy violation in so much as it's basically giving you a list of what it thinks are faces, but it could be doing the same thing about arms or feet, right? Like it's just identifying people based on a certain um,
Yeah, but
physical.
if it can know me, and it knows the day that you took that, and it knows where you took it, and say you're just a Google Plus user, or you have your email tied in, it can also figure out if Google wanted to any of that additional information, whether or not they're doing it right now. Second,
Oh,
we
I
know
totally agree with you.
that both the US and the Canadian government are working to have access to all of this information that basically travels through either country. So
Right.
whether or not Google's doing anything with it, or is looking to, doesn't mean, like, once it's out there, right? Um, so, and I'm not trying to say, like, well, okay. The immediate reaction is one to be like, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but again, this isn't a conspiracy. This is like documented, what the current state of, data privacy and public privacy and security of information versus security of states, and where the tech is enabling it. Like, the tech is always
Sure.
way ahead, and right now we're at a point where this stuff is probably more impactful than like crazy drone robots coming to destroy you, right? Like, drones are crazy, wow, but just being able to just say, okay, Google, tell me everything about me.
Yeah.
And it's just a Photos app, man. Like,
Well, it's a Photos app, but I mean, I'm as usual going to play the devil's advocate. I love this thing. It's like I have nothing to hide, and I'm going to be that guy who says I have nothing to hide, and therefore this actually helps me quite a lot, right? So, what it's doing is it's indexing my photos in a way that is extremely beneficial to me as somebody who tries to archive, his photo library in a number of services. And I've tried Apple Photos, I've tried Dropbox Carousel, I've tried Flickr. Google Photos makes the most sense to me because it has the most data points. Um, there is an element of creepiness to it, but I guess it's because I have a relationship with Google, the company, that I that I don't mind the sort of privacy disruptions if it's to my benefit. Now,
yeah, but are you gonna? But you're tying, and I understand what you're saying. Like so, but to talk this through is that your relationship with Google is now creating a situation where I have a relationship with Google through you.
no,
and we've never had a conversation about.
We don't know that. I mean,
we don't know that, but like,
it's presumed.
Yeah.
So I guess it matters only if Google is sharing that information with other companies or using that data from what's inside of the Photos app to sell more ads. Like if I mean, say eventually when you're searching for, I want to buy you a birthday present. I think that you would like a new pair of sunglasses, right? So the next time I look up sunglasses, instead of it showing me an ad on the side of Google, it may show your face because it took it from Google Photos and say, hey, Douglas needs a new pair of sunglasses. Mm-hmm. Here's a great pair that would fit on his face. I mean, think about the implications for the fact that it can now place ads, not just with what you're searching, but with,
that's already been happening. Like that happens on Facebook. I feel like Microsoft has already been doing that with Bing, where it's like, hey, your friends really like this. Like they've already been using people's faces in ads to imply like, 30 of your friends use this store. Go check it out. And like, it's a photo of like my buddy Dave. I'm like, oh, Dave, how did you get on this search engine? And like, I get all of this. I want to use the app too, so I understand where you're coming from. So it's not even like a devil's advocate kind of role. It's more just like, the fact that you have, quote unquote, nothing to hide is, I think, irrelevant because supposedly we live in a society where the burden on sharing information is on the requirement of that. So no matter what you're doing, having something to hide or nothing to hide isn't the deciding factor for information being shared. Second, when having nothing to hide changes from like, I don't have stolen cash in my mattress in my house to I can infer and know everything about you just by having access to this data. What is hide? Like, what if it's just something simple as like, hey, remember that day where we told our boss, Ian Hardy, we were going to a meeting with some company and we totally went to Kensington and just got loaded with fellow tech writers. And we took a photo that day and people are tagged in that photo and it has the date and the location and you can know that you weren't where you said you were going to be that day. Like, hiding isn't a matter of, and that was a hypothetical, by the way. We have never done that.
Yeah, sure.
But like those types of situations where like you don't even know the types of things that can be inferred and therefore must be hidden or not, because this isn't like a binary privacy gateway anymore. It isn't a search warrant into your car or your home or anything. It's like there's a digital life out there. And once that box opens, like it's not even about closing it again. It's about just, what Google does, mining and sorting the information that's there.
Right, but that's been done. I mean, I'm failing to see a difference between photos other than what you already described, how there's an emotional impact and an emotional association with personal photos over what Google has been doing on an opt-in basis for years. They've been mining your data every time you've made a search, every time you open an email.
Totally. I think maybe that the larger point is that there really is no difference. This is just it's like either another version of that, which I am having a more emotional reaction to, because it is like, oh man, it's your photos. It's just people. It's just people and places and times, things that are very tangible in a way that amorphous, like, oh, I've never said anything about Obama in my emails. I'm totally cool. Like it's just more, you can grasp onto the idea of that a little bit more deeply, but then also, hey, this is a very visible example of how good they are at this in ways that like showing an ad on the side of your search window, like this is much more impressive and therefore indicates a level of sophistication and capability maybe beyond ad placement. So I'm not saying that this is like a new or different thing. I'm just saying, like, man, did it kick off a conversation in my own head and with others about, do we really, like, what are we signing up for?
And that's what Apple's argument against companies like Google continues to be, and that's why Tim Cook took such a strong stance against this when he spoke he spoke at a nonprofit at a gala around privacy and security last week, where he didn't single out Google itself, but he singled out companies that mine data like Google to its own benefit, where the customer is the is the product, and I think that it speaks to the fact that Apple tries to get by on delivering what it calls secure, end-to-end secure internet services, but it continues to lag as a result of that, right? And the second it attempts to, there's so many rumors about what's going to happen next week at WWDC. It's going to release a Google Now competitor. There's going to be, Apple has no choice but to take on a lot more of this machine learning type stuff in order to keep up with Google. But the problem is that when Apple says it never sells your data, it tries to keep your data secure, it just has a lot less data, period, of its users, right?
Yeah.
And when it says, like, okay, it's storing your contacts, your photos, your calendar on iCloud, it's essentially just a repository, right? It's a dumb pipe.
It's a dumb bucket.
The same way that carriers are supposed to be dumb pipes for the internet. The problem is that carriers are finding that they're being squeezed by being pushed into that role, because as anything, when you become a dumb pipe, you essentially are becoming a commodity. Apple's at an advantage because its profit isn't made on services. So it's not really at a risk of becoming commoditized in that way. But as a result, there's less incentive for Apple to innovate on the services side, because that isn't their goal. Their goal is to sell hardware and use those internet services as a way to incentivize the sale of that hardware. But it's never
and a lot of purpose. A lot of Apple's software strength comes from third parties because we all use their hardware, right?
Correct. So the developer tools are really what it comes down to. But I was talking about this with Eric Lehman yesterday on Fresh Fruit. Why then does Apple, on one hand, deny that it's doing what Google's doing by mining data, and yet allow Google's software on its App Store to do the same thing? Of course, it's within the terms and conditions of its App Store, but essentially, it's saying one thing on one hand and then going back on its word on another.
Well, because it can't not. It has to.
And of course it can. It could specify that any app that sends data to third-party advertisers, or any app that has connections to Google's ad network, is banned. It could do that if it really wanted to.
Yeah, and then there were a lot of people going over to Android just so they could use Gmail properly.
Well, that was once Android's biggest claim to fame, is that it worked better with Google services.
Yeah.
But since Google started taking a more vested interest in iOS as a way to expand its own services, some people have argued that the iPhone is actually a better way to communicate with Google than an Android.
Well, but the time in which Apple could have prevented that, there's just too much momentum in terms of, they're just beyond the time where they could really cut that back.
Right, but then they can't say that they're 100% for its users' privacy. They're basically hedging it by saying that as long as the user is within the iCloud network, as long as you're John Gruber, who doesn't use any Google services,
Shout outs Gruber.
then your stuff is safe.
Well, but it's more just like we're not gonna do this to our customers, and they have the choice to do that if they want to, but they should be aware we're not limiting. You can very much be like, you could live off of, for the longest time I was a mail user. Like it's been a slow addition of Google services to my iOS world. Like you can live totally outside of that. Like app for whatever the value of each individual service, Apple still provides all the little check boxes that anyone else does.
Sure. I mean, you could live in Mail. You could live on iCloud.com as your email. You could live on Apple Maps. You could live on Reminders. You could live, those things exist obviously only within the Apple ecosystem. The benefit and beauty of Google is that it does allow you to do these things cross-platform for the most part, but also that the core products are just better products in many ways. I mean, I'm constantly finding that the hardware portion for me is what keeps me on iPhone, and then the software and services portion is now almost equally distributed between Google and Microsoft. Since Microsoft purchased Wunderlist, they purchased Sunrise, they purchased Acompli. I use all three of those services on my iPhone, and I use Sunrise synced with my Google Calendar. You know what I'm saying? Like there's
totally. No, yeah, and Apple has never really been like, what was the last piece of like pure software that Apple really made as a profit-making mechanism?
Well,
the closest thing is iTunes, and even then that was directly connected to hardware. Like they've never been a services company. All of their iOS services are still come from that traditional, I'm an OS manufacturer, so we need, you need a note app and you need a calendar app, and like, we live in a world like from that 90s reality of like the platform provider provided like 80% of the core software for the platform.
Right.
It was bundled together, and then you could get the internet and a few third-party applications. Whereas now is like the OSs are really just runtimes for third-party applications in the web.
Yeah, but that's not true. I mean, buy a brand new iPhone, and you have all of your iWork apps pre-installed. You can create.
Oh, totally. But what are the apps that the average person uses every day? Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Slack. Like all of those things are no longer OS provider level applications. Like, yes,
no, they're
Apple
not.
Still provides great like iWork, but those are the things that in the PC prior to the post PC world were the software that people used every day, and now there's actually real consumer software that people do use every day, and those are made by the Web 2.0 companies essentially.
Well, that's not entirely true. Google Apps has a pretty significant market share in the enterprise world, and I think Google is increasingly trying to figure out its place as both a consumer company and a business company. Apple too has partnered with IBM to make its services. IBM is making the software. I mean, Apple knows where its strengths lie, and it's in the hardware. It's a vertically integrated company. It makes the hardware on top, and then allows third-party developers to add to that core experience.
No. I know. I'm just saying, like, so, like, if you if you were using a MacBook in the 90s or the early 2000s, let's say, updating your OS was huge because predominantly all the things that you were using with that MacBook were features and software coming with the OS bundled in, right? Like your mail client, your calendar, your content editing suite, whether that's Word documents, PowerPoint presentations, video, all of that came bundled with an OS because the OS, like it was, functions were tied to the operating system. And then at a certain point, the web came in, and you were doing a lot of those things that were traditionally like applications you'd click on your desktop. You're just doing in the browser. And in the mobile space, a lot of those applications that you use on a daily level are provided by, through an app store. They don't come with, iOS. And
they
while
do come with Google. I mean, like, say you live in the Google ecosystem, you still download those apps through the iOS App Store. Those are third-party apps, but those are core Google services that come bundled on every Android phone. They have to, as part of the agreement with OEMs.
Totally, but you're still, even on Android, you're still using Facebook, Twitter, like those types of things that, if this were the 90s, like if the mobile tech had come out in the 90s, you would have like, and we had this with like MSN chat and things like that. And what was that old chat app that Apple had built that like still works with iMessage, but no one's used it for 20 years? But it would have been like Microsoft Book, and like every platform provider would have done their version of every type of experience that you need. And now, not only do they leave it up to third-party manufacturers or like software developers, but then their services aren't even tied to their platforms anymore.
Yeah, but you're forgetting that Facebook tried that and failed. Facebook tried to integrate into a smartphone with, HTC on Android and failed miserably, and then tried again with Facebook Home and failed miserably. And now they're trying to more surreptitiously insert itself into Android and, to a lesser extent, iPhone by, I guess, creating a platform within a platform. So Facebook has become this ubiquitous way for developers to create experiences within other apps. So you have Giphy creating a third-party iOS app that doesn't work on its own. It has to only work within Facebook's Messenger app. But Facebook Messenger is still an app that you download.
Totally.
And
and that's my point. Like, Facebook was trying to create a world in which they were the new Microsoft. And everyone was like, nope, we don't want that. We like the internet and third-party apps and things. So, version 2. Like plan B is to buy all the independent apps that people use and then just be the connection portal to all those things, which again is about the data, not the front end experience. But they were trying to like make, you're right, Facebook phones with Facebook this, Facebook that. And then they realized it was just easier to just buy the things that people use, make sure Facebook Connect is in it, own all the information, and then monetize it through ads.
Yeah, but Microsoft is essentially doing what Facebook decided to do, right? Like, Facebook started buying up smaller startups and integrating it loosely into its ecosystem, like Instagram, like WhatsApp, and Microsoft with its recent purchases has been doing essentially the same thing.
Yeah,
the Comply quite quickly turned into Outlook for mobile. But Outlook for mobile is still a very independent app compared to Outlook for desktop and tablets. I don't see Sunrise or Wunderlist disappearing as brands anytime soon and be integrated.
Yeah,
other than kind of opening their APIs and more assertively integrating into the core Microsoft ecosystem. But Facebook's got this distinct advantage. They are platform agnostic. They are a web service that happens to be really good at making mobile apps. And, Google has decided that in order for its services to proliferate, it needs to be the same kind of company. Mm-hmm. So it can't distinguish between iOS and Android anymore. Even though it owns Android, it's still very much a services company that relies primarily on ads to and big data to be successful.
Totally. I completely agree. When I was using Microsoft in that example, I'm thinking of the classic Gates Ballmer era Microsoft. And you're totally right that Microsoft has learned its lesson in a way that, say, BlackBerry didn't, and is trying to be a distributed kind of Google company. Facebook wanted the internet to be basically like, oh, I'm going to sign into the internet, and that would just be facebook.com. And everyone would live inside Facebook and it'd be a wonderful, happy blue place. and they're twisting their strategy to reflect the actual desires of current users. And I'm sure Apple would very much like the only applications or things that you would do on its hardware would be either things that it's built or third-party developers that don't in any way compete with it. But we're too far in the stage of the game for them to deny the other major services providers.
Yeah, I don't know about that. I think Apple has come to terms with the fact that so I think we have to distinguish between certain kinds of consumers, right? You and I will go out into the App Store and we'll seek out great experiences. We'll follow the blogs and figure out what's best and replace our apps
where no one has gone before.
Right. Like I go to Product Hunt every day for a reason. Shout out Product Hunt TO. So, I think that, people like my fiance who loathe updating apps, she doesn't update her OS. She doesn't seek out new experiences unless I explicitly say, hey, this is a better version of the thing that you're currently using. Mm-hmm. And I think that Apple builds those services into its OS because it knows, and it probably has a lot of data to back this up, that unless you're going into an iPhone or an iPad using Google Docs or Sheets or Slides, numbers and whatever slideshow, I don't know what the names of the Apple services are going to be just fine, right? And every year Apple says, hey, we updated our iWork suite to be more compatible with current standards and it's more beautiful and blah blah blah.
Totally.
But it knows that the people using those are not using them because they're the best. It's because they're the path of least resistance.
Yeah. Well, at the end of the day, if you're going to release an OS, it has to have some functionality to it. Otherwise, it's just an app launcher. It's just like a boot ROM to the internet, right? I totally agree. But there was a time when a company like Microsoft could say to mess with its competitors, like we're not bringing Outlook to Mac. No, you'll never get Outlook. What you will get is a really crappy third-party product that we bought, which is purple and ugly, called Entourage, which will always be worse than Outlook, so that we can say we support this platform, but really we want you buying PCs because that's where we make our money. Well, that world doesn't exist anymore.
It was a matter of being like, hey, we want to support Outlook as in a very kind of high level, in the sense that we want to support ActiveSync, where we want to pay very little to give you Exchange support without paying Microsoft a boatload of money to actually bundle the full Office experience. And that's why Microsoft's had so much success with Office 365, because it's basically a subscription service.
Yeah, well, because once their revenue came from not using the services that were tied to their OS, but just paying for their services that people wanted, it became their incentive to make great services live everywhere. So you'll sign up, right? And that's that shift. But so drawing it all the way back to kind of like Google and Apple now, I think you're totally right. Where let's take a look at I/O versus what WWDC should be next week. So you have Android M, which is from the mobile side. Yeah, we're just cleaning it up, making some things better. There's a new Photos app.
It's actually a really cool feature, though. I don't know if so Now on Tap is probably the most exciting feature of Android M that nobody can use right now because it's not integrated into the M developer preview. But essentially, it's giving you context about the content in your app. Yeah. So, you can highlight a certain word or a certain phrase in your app and get these plants into other apps or into other, to Google's knowledge graph. And to me, that's where Google's strengths lie.
Totally. And it's something that Amazon's been doing as well, right? With its in the Prime service, you can kind of call up similar information, but this will be for everything, right?
Yeah, and I mean, they're doing that with Alexa. What's it called? Well, it looks like my computer decided to take a bit of a break during the podcast, so we lost the GarageBand audio, which we had been, at least on my end. So unfortunately, the audio you're listening to is the Hangouts audio. That's not as high quality. My apologies for that. Yeah. But let's wrap it up, because I think
because Google is listening and they're tired of us talking about them in this manner.
Yeah, I think that's really what it comes down to. What's going to happen tomorrow or next week at WWDC, which you can find all the details on at mobilesyrup.com, is that Apple is also in a very similar position to Google. It's trying to make these small iterative changes. The one thing that you'll notice about iOS 9, from what I'm hearing, is it's going to be a lot more stable. It's going to work a lot better on older devices than iOS 8 did. It's probably going to put a lot of the infrastructure in place for expansion of Apple Pay. So what we're hearing is that Apple Pay is going to debut in the fall in Canada.
And that's likely to not be announced, right? Like they'll do the Apple Pay announcement when it happens, but the infrastructure will be in iOS 9, right?
My guess is that they will say something about international expansion without specifying any other countries.
Okay.
They're not going to just leave the Apple Pay API on its by itself. So they'll say blah blah blah, we've improved Apple Pay in this way. Watch later this year for more information or whatever. And I'm guessing that Apple Pay will come to Canada with the debut of the next iPhone. And transit information in the Apple Maps app, which nobody really cares about. And I also think that there will be just an emphasis on how apps work better together. I think the Extensions SDK introduced some amazing desktop-like experiences in iOS 8 while keeping the sandbox intact. And I think that we'll see a lot more from on the continuity side, on the handoff side, on the extension side.
Health kit, home kit, all the kits.
Yeah, home Mark Gurman from 9 to 5 Mac has said will be a standalone app introduced in iOS 9, similar to Health. And HomeKit devices have already hit the market, so we'll see something happen for sure. Whether or not it'll be as impactful as Apple says it will, who knows? The other thing that they will announce that we probably won't get immediately, at least, is Apple Music, which is what they've done with Beats and basically just revamped it. We don't know whether it'll debut on Android. If it does, it'll be the first Apple-built product that debuted on Android, but I mean, they really have no incentive to do that. So I don't know. I mean, I'm trepidatious about WWDC. It's it's a big deal for Apple developers. But this year, we may not get the Apple TV that everybody's been promised because they've been delaying.
I don't think it's happening, man. I think if you can't get the content, it doesn't matter how nice of a TV it is.
Oh, no, it's not I don't think it's a television. I mean, I'm talking about the next generation Apple TV set-top box. That's been rumored to debut, but they couldn't get the deals in place with the licensees, or licensors. They couldn't get the SDK out in time. So I don't know. WWDC may be a bit more subdued this year.
Well, so look at it this way. Like Google I/O, similar to WWDC from a mobile perspective of clean up a few specific features, enhancements to services, but nothing crazy. And then on the other side, ATAP building crazy next gen, connected clothing, VR, everything, right? Like all these crazy things. But Apple doesn't have that other side of its company that's working on stuff like that.
Well, they do. They just don't have it publicly. You can bet your ass that they have something internally, that's like ATAP. I agree.
But at an announceable level, are they doing anything with connected clothing? No.
I mean, they're a much more conservative company in that regard. They're more careful about not announcing beta products. They want to, when they announce something, it's integrated into their existing hardware platform.
Yeah, shipping next week kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So, that's like we're going to get a preview of the Apple Watch native SDK, and that should be a big deal for developers. But, that's another thing that, we'll have to wait and see because, it's a matter of storage. It's a matter of still, even though they'll be native on the watch, will they still be limited by Bluetooth. I mean, these things are all, while iOS is very mature right now, WatchKit is not, and that's just another issue for developers to tackle. So we'll be back here next week, and we'll take a look at all the announcements. And I'd really like, maybe next week we can talk a little bit more about ATAP and what they're doing with Project Soli and Project Jacquard, because I got to demo those early hardware products, and they're just amazing, especially Project Jacquard. Even though conductive materials in clothing is not a new thing, the way that it's been integrated into this sort of
being
project has been amazing.
Yeah.
And the fact that they're working with Levi's is just crazy.
Makes your butt happy.
Well, I hope your butt stays happy and your back feels better. We will be back next week with another episode of SyrupCast. Thank you so much for listening, and have a great week, everybody.
Shout out to LeBron.